Good morning, Gold Room. How's everybody doing this morning? Welcome to day 2 of the WCEF. What a fantastic day we've got in store for you. My name is Pep Rosenfeld from the Boom Chicago Comedy Theater in Amsterdam. I'll be with you all day. Well, I won't be with you all day. I'll be with you at the beginning of the day, end of the day, and twice during the middle of the day. If you're on the same parallel sessions as I, you know as well as I, there's a myriad sessions. Congratulations to all of you for being here bright and early this morning. Odysseus had to get through Scylla and Charmides in getting back home in the Odyssey, and you all had to get through the twin monsters of Brussels weather and Brussels traffic, and I commend you for it. Well done, everyone. Well done. Yesterday was a fantastic day. I hope you were inspired. I hope you were enlightened. I hope you made many new circular friends and discussed circular things and made some connections that can last. I wanted to just share with you a few numbers from yesterday that I found particularly impressive. The first number, of course, being 8,000. That was the number of people participating in this event online. 8,000 people all around the world watching this event. Yeah, absolutely. 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 And let me make this an action shot. All right. 1,300, that's the number of people that were here in the square yesterday. 1,300 people came here to be part of this event. I think that's fantastic. Of that 1,300, 100 different countries were represented in the building yesterday. That is half the amount of countries in the whole world. Fantastic. Then a couple of personal numbers, 3.5, that is the number of minutes that the microphone was off at the beginning of the day yesterday. 17, that's the number of minutes it felt like, both for me and for you. And 8, that's the number of people who came up to me and asked, did you guys plan that? No, we did not plan that. And we can, I don't have another slide, so just, you'll be staring at 8 for a while. Today, we're going to continue to dive deeper into practical cases and solutions within specific sectors. We're going to be looking at the bioeconomy with a special look at the global south. We'll be thinking about infrastructure, covering urbanization and insights from across the globe in Oceania and beyond. We'll look at consumption and production, where we'll be unveiling what's happening on the Chinese circularity front and have some insights about behavior change for even more sustainable consumption. And it all starts with the following panel that you are here just in time for. This panel delves into the largely uncharted interplay between circular economies and global stability. We'll be examining how shifting away from from resource-heavy practices may alter international interdependencies and provoke structural changes over the next decade and a half. Circular economy principles focusing on regeneration and efficiency are not just about resource management. No, they're also increasingly seen as allies in peacebuilding and strengthening community resilience. This discussion will pivot on understanding these dual aspects, addressing the potential risks and embracing the harmonious benefits of circular models in fostering a more resilient and more interconnected world. Now, I've been saying we quite a bit, but this half of the we will have very little to do with it. This panel is going to be run by someone who can handle it much better than I. So I'd like to introduce Olivia Lazard, a fellow at Carnegie Europe. Her research focuses on the geopolitics. Oh, I had a whole bio for you.
Oh, well, you can keep on going.
All right.
Go ahead.
Well, you can read it over my shoulder. Her research focuses on the geopolitics of climate, the transition ushered by climate change, and the risks of conflict and fragility associated to climate change and environmental collapse. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, just very light stuff for this morning.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, Olivia Lazard.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Climate mitigation, security, and peace are inextricably linked. A climate-safe world is fundamental for a peaceful world. The energy transition and the move towards circularity are an imperative for a climate-safe world. Irony has it, though, that the road to a climate-safe world is very far from a peaceful one. Now that we've reached the implementation phase of climate-related transitions and that we observe the rise in global tensions, the breakdown of the global order, and the threat of war in real time, some of the risks associated to transitioning a whole economy and whole energy systems are becoming obvious but barely so. We barely understand why, what is happening, and what are the links essentially between global competition and what is considered a safe transition for all. So understanding how transitions threaten the very fabric of an old system that delivered peaceful dividends is absolutely crucial to identify how to design energy and economic transitions that are effective and that indeed deliver a world that is safe, just, equitable, and peaceful. So what are the threats? What are the risks that we need to be talking about this morning? There are many, because obviously transitioning one system into one state of equilibrium into another is very complex. But I will help by framing the conversation with three important aspects of the depth, essentially, of the change that we're about to embark upon. First, the world economy relies on global supply chains, specialized economies of scale, and comparative advantages. It's been that way for hundreds of years. And it's been a system that's been in the process of being refined for those hundreds of years. It is a construction. Our global economic system is a global construction built upon complex interdependencies. And interdependencies don't just have an economic function in the form of resource efficiency and economic efficiency. They have a political function too. They provide peace dividends, as long as interdependencies do not tip into over-dependencies. Countries and communities that trade with one another simply have less incentives to go to war or into unmanageable competition. By contrast, circular economies respond to a resource efficiency and resilience imperative in the face of climate change in particular, and in the face of over-extraction and over-material consumption. But at their current level of design, it is unclear what political dividends circular economic models provide, and if they can help to secure the peace dividend that our post-war world was built upon in the last 80 years. Two, there are specific commodities and products that will keep requiring primary extraction for at least another decade. Critical minerals. I'm sure that a lot of you have heard about these things. When I say critical minerals, I include cobalt, rare earths, graphite, copper, all the stuff that are necessary in order to create the new energy infrastructure of our world, knowing that energy and security are fundamentally related to one another. Critical minerals, obviously, rely on mining, on processing, on technological innovation to understand how to build the better and the best possible forms of storage and the best clean tech in the future. This means essentially that we're about to face a new moment of history, a critical juncture of history, really, where we're going to have additional waves of extractivism, and the locations where those minerals are found are not innocuous. Outside of China, the US, Russia, Canada, and Australia, a lot of minerals are found in countries of the global south, in Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia. These countries, for some of them, happen to already be conflict affected. In some circumstances, they are fragile. They suffer from high levels of corruption and from institutional fragility. They also happen to be very climate vulnerable. Extractivism, we've known it for a long time in the peacebuilding world, can correlate with resource capture, resource depletion, and in some contexts, acute conflicts. This means essentially that the energy transition carries within its fold an exponential potential for various forms of violence, including conflict, but not just. because a lot of these critical minerals are also found on indigenous peoples' lands, as well as biodiversity hotspots, carbon sequestering ecosystems, and water-stressed areas. We're essentially sort of layering on a number of different risk factors that create a lot of potential for human insecurity, national insecurity, regional and international insecurity. So the irony is that a climate-safe future is built on the back of potentially conflictual relationships regarding land management in areas of extraction and high risks for extractivisms to lead to forms of socio-economic fragmentation, elite capture, and maladaptation from a climate perspective. This leads me to my third point. Anyone who understands this has a natural reflex, which is to say and to go towards a reduction of our material footprint at a global level, to make sure essentially that demand does not lead to the destruction of the very habitats that support and shelter us and does not inflict violence on peoples outside of very sort of high and energy intensive areas. This is the logical reaction, and even then there is a bump in the road. The shift in energy and economic systems is essentially paving the way for a shift in power relations at the international level. Ukraine is one of the ground zeros for how a new form of competition is playing out today between different blocs that are essentially trying to shape the outcome of the energy transition and of the economic transition. This shift in power relations is built on the back of critical minerals and is raging over the outcomes of the energy, economic, technological, and security transition that we're undertaking. In other words, the conversations that we're having today are not happening in a vacuum. They are happening in a space filled with hope and inspiration for a better world, but they're also happening in a space filled with dangerous competition over the ways that the world will be shaped, what security architectures will be created around it, and what interests this may serve. And this is giving rise to new forms of security dilemmas, leading to increased demand for the very commodities and products that create the very drivers of insecurity, leading us towards planetary insecurity. This plants a decor for you. The next decade is the make or break decade for transformation. In these 10 years, we need to remetabolize the world's economy and reinvent how economics, peace, and security interrelate and interact with one another. So what are the ways in which economic remetabolization can create peace dividends? What are the interdependencies that will hold our peace and security architectures into balance? How do we use circular economic design as a way to travel through the changes while accounting for risks? These are questions that we will be exploring in this coming panel, which is essentially introductory, because we'll only be scratching the surface. And in order to start, I'd like first to turn to a video that Achim Steiner, administrator of the UNDP, the UN Development Programme, and vice chair of the UN Sustainable Development Group, sent for us to start this panel.
Distinguished panelists, dear colleagues and friends, on behalf of the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, it is a privilege to join this year's World Circular Economy Forum via this video message. We are seeing how unsustainable consumption and production and the ever-growing race for resources are driving plummeting biodiversity loss and dangerous levels of fossil fuel emissions, blighting global ecological systems and threatening the certainty of our food, energy and water. The twin engines of sustainable development, equity and security are only possible within stable planetary systems. Moreover, in the past 60 years, at least 40% of all conflicts have had a link to natural resources. To achieve our climate and nature goals and support the leap to a thriving, peaceful future on a healthy planet, I would like to outline 3 cycles of renewal. First, as the climate emergency intensifies, we must insert the genetic code of the circular economy into countries' nationally determined contributions, or NDCs as they are called, that represent sovereign investment plans for the future. This is amongst the aims of UNDP's Climate Promise Initiative, which supports over 120 countries to enhance and implement their NDCs, including 50 fragile and conflict-affected countries and territories. These NDCs draw on the knowledge and needs of all stakeholders, including indigenous peoples, women, and young people, which is vital to fostering stability and also advancing human rights. Yet only approximately 1/4 of NDCs have an explicit reference to the circular economy. In response, UNEP, UNFCCC, and UNDP have joined to develop a toolbox to support countries to directly integrate the circular economy into their NDCs, an initiative generously supported by CITRA and the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Second, a clean energy transition that also promotes peace and stability will have to ensure that circularity is built in by design. For instance, through our engagements in countries such as Sudan and Yemen, UNDP is now seeing how expanding access to clean and affordable energy can kickstart economies and set the foundations for recovery and resilience. We are also witnessing a growing demand for transition-critical minerals, predominantly extracted from the Global South, which could cause an ever more detrimental impact on the environment and people unless well-planned and managed. It is therefore paramount to ensure that the clean energy transition is equitable, resource-efficient, and inclusive with the least impact on the environment. In particular, this energy transition could be enhanced by circular solutions and South-South cooperation for bioenergy in the agriculture sector and food value chains, benefiting people, nature, and climate. Finally, adopting circularity is essential to protect and restore ecosystems and rebuild natural capital, hence increasing also the resilience and sustainability of communities. That is a principle underpinning UNDP's Nature Pledge, which is now supporting 140 countries to implement the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, including via national biodiversity strategies and action plans and biodiversity finance plans. The circular economy is also at the heart of UNDP's Zero Waste Initiative, where we work alongside cities to convert waste to resources, close landfills, and build public and private partnerships towards zero waste and zero pollution. Distinguished panelists, dear colleagues, in short, our new global circular regenerative economy must draw lessons from nature's cycle and ingenuity, where nothing is discarded but instead embraced as nutrients and raw material for the next cycle of growth and renewal. In that spirit, I would like to wish you a most productive discussion and thank you once again for providing me with this opportunity to address you by means of this message. Thank you.
Achim wanted to be with us this morning. Unfortunately, he couldn't, but we're very lucky to have with us Patrick Schröder, Senior Research Fellow at Chatham House. Please join us on stage, as well as Emily Barran, Green Industrialisation Lead at Kaptoyo. Thank you for welcoming them on stage. Patrick, I've already started talking about some of the risks, essentially, of the energy and the economic transition, but obviously there are many more. Would you like to talk to us about some of the risks that you observe also in your research?
Yes, yeah, thank you for the question, and thanks for inviting me to join the panel. It's indeed timely to discuss the relationship between the circular economy and international politics, something that we haven't done enough yet. And as Olivia already remarked, there are changes not only, we see changes happening in the global architecture, in the international system. So it's not only that there's an energy transition and a circular economy transition, but also an international systems transition. And we're not quite sure yet what the shape of this new system will be, but we can already see its influenced by great power competition and is also influenced by increasing levels of mistrust between global north and global south. And that's a departure from the previous international system that we're used to since the end of the Cold War for the last 30 years. And you mentioned risk. So there are three risks, I think, which are quite relevant. The first one, and you referred to that as well, so potential conflicts over critical resources that are needed for the energy transition, conflicts over land. And these might initially be local conflicts, but there's the potential that they spill over and create more international disruption. I think the second big risk is what people and analysts have already called a new Cold War between the US and China. So if this new Cold War transforms into a hot conflict, that will have significant disruptions not only to electronics value chains, but also to value chains around critical raw materials and energy technologies. The third risk I see is not actually international, but it's domestic. But this is connected also to what's happening on international level, and this is political opposition to the transition. In the news we've seen recently, or here in Brussels in real life, farms protests. There's also resistance towards changes in heating system. All of that has also the potential to create a lot more disruption. Now, the circular economy potentially can be a solution to these risks. A circular economy that keeps resources, materials and products in the loop, reducing the overall demand for materials. But it depends on the way the circular economy transition is implemented. And one of the trends that we've observed in our research is that the circular economy is being included in securitization agendas of resources. Securitization means that an issue is becoming a topic for national security. And that puts it into a different category. It brings in a range of different actors who are looking at it. And we can see this in, for example, some of the critical raw material strategies that have been put out over the last couple of years by major economies. So the risk of having the circular economy aligned very closely with the securitization agenda is that it feeds into nationalist sentiment, something that we've called circular resource nationalism, leading to more isolationist policies, trade disputes, et cetera, et cetera. So securitization is maybe one aspect, but it's risky and it's not the full solution to providing a peaceful transition.
And could you maybe just take one moment to make the difference between securitization and security?
Well, securitization, I think, it depends also how you find security, human security or environmental security. So these are broader concepts than just a national security, which maybe looks specifically at defense capabilities and all of this.
So I think what I draw from what you're saying is that because of the sort of global uncertainty regarding the state of the transitions, there is a propensity essentially to do protectionism, to sort of go back to trying to ensure one's own interests, either from a country perspective or a regional perspective. And this can essentially lead to the same type of reflexes, which in and of itself may actually create over time incentives for resource scrambling, right? Because there is no coordination or no common approach and collective approach towards how we organize a collective transition that needs to serve the benefits of peace, security, equitability, and that kind of thing. Yeah?
Yes, I agree. And that's maybe another trend that we observe in the international system at the moment, lack of ability to manage and coordinate sufficiently these global risks that emerge and guide the transition to achieve the inclusive and peaceful outcomes that we want.
Right, thank you. Emily, you work particularly in African contexts, and CAPE, the Climate Action Platform Africa, is one of the leading think tanks trying to look at the opportunities of the energy transition, which obviously also means looking first at the risks. So before we talk about the opportunities that you see, which I find very interesting and I want to tease out of you for this panel, I want to sort of ask you what you observe in your daily work. How are those risks that Patrick and I talked about materializing, if at all, on the African continent?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for inviting me to join. It's a really fascinating conversation. I mean, I think that very simplistically, the biggest risk is a repeat of the past. And it's been called a new dash for minerals. It's been called a kind of second wave of colonialism. But I mean, that's the most simplistic risk, is that we replace kind of one for one how our old order or the current order has worked with a new resource input in critical minerals. But the economic system doesn't change at all. And sort of breaking that out and explaining what I mean by that, I think, it's well known, I think, to most people at this gathering that we are moving for the first time in our history from the most efficient source of power to a less efficient source of power. Yeah. And the total volume of things we are going to extract or need to extract is going to increase exponentially, and that's been well described over the last day. I think the geopolitics of this is that the West and allies, when it comes to control of the minerals, the manufacturing, the materials, from an African perspective, really are nowhere. So to take one example, the DRC produces, I think it's around 50%, 70% of the world's cobalt. 16 out of 19 cobalt mines are owned by the Chinese. Yeah. Now, I don't want to make any statements in terms of kind of the politics of that, but dominance on one entity in any market is inherently a sort of a setup for instability. And so I think understanding how we can create some balance and how African nations can lead that sort of ability to find balance is going to be really critical. So we have some efforts. There's an initiative called the Lobito Corridor, which is a transport linkage from DRC out to the western side through Angola, which would allow the US and its allies to sort of control some of that value chain. And there are real efforts to think about how to kind of shift that dynamic and create balance, to use that word. But what we've seen time and time again is that very often the West moves too slowly. Projects take twice as long to come to fruition when they're financed by the US and allies than they do when they're financed by the Chinese. And so when we think about the offer that is being made, it needs to be better to create that balance. I think finally, the other risk that we really see playing out on a kind of country-by-country level in bilateral agreements and agreements between the EU, the UK, the US, is really a lack of coordination between stated climate ambitions and individual trade agreements. So we're not seeing sort of joined up thinking and coordination. So you end up with sort of trade agreements on one hand that don't speak to energy ambition on the other hand, that don't speak to sort of, and development efforts that don't speak to kind of strategic need for certain minerals. And that sort of lack of coordination, I think, is really creating an opportunity for states that are much more coordinated. So maybe I can pause there and we can speak to opportunities.
I think what's interesting in what you both are saying is that technically, if we scratch behind the surface of this lack of coordination, there's also a lack of intent, maybe a lack of recognition that what we're up against is not just an economic transition or an energy transition, which requires essentially sort of redesigning relationships across the globe. But what we're failing to recognize is how these relationships will essentially build the building blocks of what is the future of peace and security. What should be in the proposition? How does trade and critical mineral strategic partnerships and infrastructure investments, how do all of these combine essentially to create or to tackle the security risks of the future, from vulnerability to climate change, to economic development, lifting people out of poverty still, and how to create essentially an economic paradigm that is indeed a lot more globally redistributive. So I want to shift maybe to the opportunities, because it's obviously all well and good to talk about risks, but we don't want to depress anyone in the room, not just yet at least. So let's maybe sort of move on to the bright side of things and how to indeed put some intentions into how to go forward with this transition. So Patrick, I'd like to come back to you to talk about these opportunities. How do you see essentially circular economic design playing into peace-building strategies, and at what level are we talking about, right? Do we stay essentially within the confines of peace-building, understood as approaches that are mostly locally relevant within a sort of liberal democracy system? Are we talking about something else? Can we extrapolate essentially on how to do circular economic design that is much broader, that invites thinking for the future of peace and security architectures?
Yeah, thank you for the question. That's
Small question.
Small question, and as you also remarked at the beginning, I think we can only scratch the surface of that today. Yeah. There's a big research agenda on how to do this, but in preparation for today, actually, I looked at some of the writings by Johan Galtung, who was the founder of the Oslo Peace Research Institute back in the 60s, and who set actually the agenda for peace building, who coined the term peace building, and who sadly just passed away 2 months ago. But for him, peace building, there's two elements to that. One element is that it requires close connections and interdependencies between countries, strong communication links, not only between countries, but between all levels of society. So that's one of the preconditions for having strong, long-term peace-building efforts. The other aspect that he was highlighting, peace-building also requires removing the underlying structures of a system that contribute to conflict. So he also termed the coin of kind of structural violence. And if we think about our economic system, about the linear system, I think we have a lot of structural violence in that system that is latent, but then causes what we see then as conflict or violent conflict erupting in wars, potentially. So then, here again, the circular economy is a solution if we change this linear system. And how do we do this now if securitization is not sufficient? And actually, fortunately, yesterday in all the sessions, many of the elements that we need were already mentioned. So several times was mentioned, okay, we need to build this stronger cooperation between Global North and Global South. I think that's essential to make sure that the benefits of a circular economy transition are shared between the countries. It's also about just transitions. That was also mentioned. So how do we ensure that, again, the benefits are shared, but also that the burdens are not placed disproportionately on one specific group or one specific region in the world. There's some other points. I just need to look at my notes here. Yeah, again, demand-side reduction, I think, is also part of the puzzle. So it's not only about how do we circulate the resources, but looking at from the demand side is key. And I think a final point is, again, comes back to the multilateral system. So at the moment, and that's also part of the research, we see that there's a governance gap at that level to coordinate on a global level the circular economy transition. So we have, and that's also part of our research, looked at what national governments do in terms of their roadmaps, their action plans, but it doesn't connect anywhere further up. So that's something I think we need to address. And we see this, for instance, this gap. We see this gap also in some of the high-level UN documents that have been published. For example, the Secretary General's new Agenda for Peace that was published last year. The initial Agenda for Peace actually published in the 1990s. So there's the need for a new agenda. And it's quite comprehensive. And it will set actually the discussion for peace and security at the upcoming UN Summit of the Future. But again, there's a lack of the issues around resources. So climate change is mentioned, but the resource agenda and how to address that is kind of one of the blind spots, I think, in my opinion.
And what resources are used for? Again,
Yeah.
there is this sort of permeating sort of geopolitical context, which is affecting essentially the type of demand for particularly critical minerals, but also other types of commodities, and what sectors they go to, right? Because critical minerals are necessary for the energy transition, but also digitalization and technologies, which are necessary for the future of economies, as well as military equipment. So these are some of the things I think that indeed, as you say, there is a big research gap and we have a lot of work ahead of us. But there is one thing that I find particularly inspiring from what CAPE is working on at the moment, which is essentially sort of looking at how to reduce indeed demand across supply chains, particularly for critical minerals, to generate energy on the basis of specific sort of what I would call bioregional context in Africa, and how extrapolating from that, this may create essentially a template for thinking about the future of economic interdependencies, which again, may be able to create peace dividends. So Emily, can you talk to us about what CAPE is onto?
Absolutely. So I use a very simple formula, 40-40-40.
Right.
So Africa has 40% of the world's renewable resources, renewable potential, 40% of the critical minerals, and by 2030, 40% of the young people. And at CAPE, what we try and do is make sure that every solution that we think through has to optimize for all of those three things. So climate action has to create jobs and it has to drive economic development. And I think that what you see from that, and I think the Brussels weather this morning is going to be the joke of the conference, but it's really proven my point, is that the solar resources, particularly, but even also with the wind resources, mean that you need much less battery storage. So in order, I mentioned earlier, we're moving to less efficient types of energy. What that means is that we need storage. So we need to incorporate variable renewable energy, we need battery storage. And about 20% of the demand for lithium-ion batteries will be for industrial and grid level storage. And because of the superior renewable resources on the continent, we estimate that you can reduce the demand for that by about 50% by just moving some of that industry to the continent. Now, that requires a level of global cooperation and sacrifice, right? That requires, genuinely saying we're actually not going to have a linear transition where we just switch out power inputs in European locations, in US locations. We're actually going to move some of that activity, and that's a pretty big ask. But the opportunity globally for Africa to drive the global energy transition is significant, and I think it's really worth considering whether or not it can be done without such a level of shift. Sort of crucially, I think the most important thing to move is the value addition to critical minerals mining. There are some really exciting early examples. On a panel yesterday, we discussed the example of a company called Bonessa, which is launching this in the DRC. It will be the first Congolese-led value addition to cobalt and copper. And this can really drive a sort of integrated ecosystem value chain approach, which allows job creation across SME value chains as well as across kind of big industrial sort of entities. I think the final thing is, how does the geopolitics and the risks that we talked about in the kind of first intervention sort of play into this. And I think there is a real opportunity through moves like the Africa Free Trade Agreement and also the proposed Africa Green Industrialisation Initiative to create a platform that allows African countries and the region to really chart a pathway through these different geopolitics. Because I think, you know, it's very pertinent. You mentioned the military sort of interventions. It's just sort of finishing on this. This isn't just about people's SUVs. This is also about military supplies, those value chains. This is about national security for some of the most powerful kind of nations in the world. And when you put it in those contexts, it's not just about the cost. It's not just about the economics of these things. It's actually about what is the stability of supply that different countries can provide, and how does one make sure that you're extracting a fair share of value from the African side as a result of providing that stability. And so we're very excited about the Africa Green Industrialisation Initiative as one way to kind of create that agency for individual countries and the region as well.
Thank you, Emily. I think that this is a perfect moment to move on to the second part of the panel. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Emily. I've loved every comment. And I'd like now to welcome on stage...
Thank you so much.
I'd like to welcome on stage Slendy Diaz, who's a circular economy expert coming to us from Colombia, and Edna Kaptoyo, who's Grantmaking and Partnership Officer at the Pawanka Fund. Welcome.
Thank you, Emily. Olivia.
Slendy, I'd like to turn to you first. You come to us from Latin America. This is a region where there is a lot of competition playing out, and sort of, you know, like, I'd like to bring the first part of a conversation about risks to what is happening in your region and what you're seeing about the ways in which Latin American countries are implementing circular economy strategies and how it's helping essentially to build up the resilience. But maybe talk to us about the specificities of how this competition, those risks are playing out in Latin America and how you're seeing countries respond.
Okay, thank you, Olivia. I'm going to talk first about some points and to better understand the risks at the end of the equation. Yeah. Latin America is currently focusing on waste management and industrial symbiosis. We need to go upstream and do more eco-design of products and services. We should prioritize climate given the region's vulnerability to climate change and reduce biodiversity loss. In that sense, we have opportunities around conservation through combo markets, biodiversity credits, forest products, and by reducing the extraction through urban mining and a more cleaner production. We are currently losing biodiversity due to changes in the use of the land to produce food, raw materials, minerals, critical minerals. And we supply 11% of the world's demands for raw materials and minerals such as gold, copper, silver, lithium, iron. To be more circular, we need to implement a regenerative approach. We need to improve our mining methods and to do circular production to increase the productivity and the efficiency of the industry and of the natural resources. The energy transition currently brings opportunities because we have abundant biomass, then we can have biofuels and bioproducts, and we also have abundant water, then we can have hydropower and a huge potential for hydrogen. We have coast, then we can produce tidal energy, and if we move to a more circular waste management, we could also produce alternative energies, increase the production of secondary raw materials and fertilizers. On the other side, Europeans provide regulation, methodologies, technologies. The challenge for this region is particularly the circular consumption, to reduce the overuse of resources, and to develop circular value chains around the whole world. You have the potential to accelerate traceability strategies to fight against the greenwashing. And finally, we need flexible and enabling regulation that facilitate the entry of Latin America circular products to the European market under fair conditions for the parties. We have certain risks if we do nothing about biodiversity. I mentioned that we are vulnerable to climate change, so food security could be under risk, and it's a huge problem. We also, and that vulnerability could have droughts, floods, also human lives and species are under risks. So that's why we need to work together to reduce the extraction, and also we need to create culture, because doing circular economy in Latin America is a little bit hard in the point that looks similar like trying to tell a rich guy that he could be out of money. So could we be losing resources? I don't see that. But when we look at the numbers, we really are losing biodiversity, and this is a treasure, is a very valuable resource that we should take care of. About Colombia is the second biodiverse country of the whole world, and the first one by square kilometers. So that would be the first topic at the agenda.
And what I find interesting, what Emily and you are saying is echoes one another, because what you're saying is essentially that Latin American countries have the opportunity to capture the potential of this sort of energy and economic transition, as long as, there are some cooperations with partners that have maybe sort of a wider lens on, what methods to use to try and sort of boost circular economies from a legal perspective, from a sort of cultural perspective, or that kind of thing. But also particularly you mentioned regeneration, and how to integrate regeneration essentially within the way in which, we move, and this is not just in Latin America, it's everyone, the sort of, economic systems. And on this, I'd like to turn to you specifically, Edna. You come from Kenya, and you also work with indigenous peoples around the world. And there is a specific, there are specific forms of knowledge and wisdom stemming essentially from indigenous knowledge that have a lot of interest for how to guide essentially the thinking, the paradigmatic shift towards circular economies. Can you talk to us about what indigenous knowledge and populations can teach, can guide in terms of shifts?
Yeah, thank you for having me in this conversation and having Pawanka Fund, which is a global indigenous-led fund accompanying indigenous peoples globally, working on their self-determined development initiatives, which also guide the way communities interact. Circularity is not new to indigenous peoples. In the way we live traditionally, I come from an indigenous community, so the way we live, I looked at circular economy and I'm like, this is how we always live. It's just the terminology. And in terms of how our economy and our way of life is governed is in the way we relate to land and nature, because it's an intrinsic part of the way we relate. And also these are guided by our traditional knowledge, which is unique in the different contexts where people live, and also the value system in the way we steward land and use resources. And we have a principle also that I saw resonate in Asia, in Africa, where I come from, and also in North America, for instance, as well as in the Pacific, where we have the 7th generation principle. That means the decisions that we make today, the way we relate to land today, has to ensure sustainability beyond 7 generations from now. So it looks into the future, and also that we ensure intergenerational equity in the way we manage our lands and ecosystems. And if you look at the traditional economies, I'm a pastoralist, but also there are those who do farming. Embedded within it are the principles that really resonate with the circular economy, issues of reciprocity, sharing, giving, but also ensuring regeneration, reuse, so sustainability is embedded in it, but also peaceful coexistence. Because our community, my peoples, the Pokot, we are beyond borders. We are not only in Kenya, we are in Uganda. We have, for instance, Gabra community in Kenya that are also in Ethiopia. So we don't have those administrative boundaries. Our people transcend beyond one border and even 5 borders. And within those communities, how they live with the land has to ensure that we also peacefully coexist within ourselves, but also with the communities as we transcend these borders. And so that is also part of our local economy. But the other aspect as well is where we have our local economies that for instance, the Gamo in Ethiopia, and we have a partner there that Pawanka has worked with, where they're revitalizing their traditional food crop called Enset. But apart from ensuring food security also, embedded in it is the reuse of those waste from it to make fabric. And also the community working to also produce pesticide from the waste as well. And we have also initiatives where communities are also doing their own renewable energy initiatives in Kenya and also in Asia. And also embedding it's culturally appropriate technology, and also innovating their technologies as they go along, using solar they harness solar as well to reduce food waste. And we have an example, for instance, for the Aymara in Chile, that they've been working with solar technology to ensure that they preserve their chuno potatoes, which is unique, and it's lasted for 10 years, and so this is some technologies that community, and they continue to innovate. However, where we see gaps is the non-inclusion in the development of policies. And I think a lot of speakers yesterday talked about cooperation, inclusion, but I think indigenous people need to be put at the center, in the decision-making table, to give their values, and also to share their perspectives on how we can include traditional knowledge, for instance, with science-based research, because I see a lot of opportunity for co-production, entry points into the development of policies, for instance, for circular economy. We need to be at the table and also to give our perspectives, because traditional knowledge systems also is not only social, but also can be included in terms of how cultural impacts also play around with the energy transitions, for instance, that we do have. And of course, I see a lot of potential as well within the development of roadmaps, because communities have lived within these ecosystems, so they know how to manage the land, and also how we can transition with the right energy partnerships, for instance, with the demand for critical minerals coming from a lot of our communities in Asia and Africa. We need to have that right energy partnership so that we ensure that transition do not have conflicts that we've had before with the previous transitions that we've seen, with the demand for minerals and also other critical elements, even when they're harnessing, for instance, energy from power or water.
Again, what I find very interesting is that what you're talking about is essentially an ability to steward the land, as you're saying, and to regenerate it so as to also generate the foundations of security, right? Food security, water security, societal security that it can be transboundary in some circumstances. And that is a way also to manage resources in a way that does not, that sort of almost creates symbiosis rather than conflicts with extraction, with the need for critical minerals, and how to sort of, create essentially an understanding and a relationship to land that helps to understand how to support the energy transition via regeneration, via the integration of indigenous knowledge and land stewardship, resource stewardship, in a way that is not just sustainable, but really primarily regenerative in order to move towards sustainability. And I wonder, Slendy, because we talk generally about regeneration in relationship to communities. But this thinking, and you mentioned it before, also needs to be integrated in how industries and companies function. So I'm wondering if you can share some insights about how implementing circular economy strategies for companies, but also for cities in Latin America, can help essentially to build resilience, going from more I would say hardware type of contexts, which we tend to focus on as being the foundations of international security, where the industrial stuff happen.
Okay, developing countries repair, reuse, and refurbish by default. So there is an opportunity to be stronger in this market. Latin America is a region of SMEs. We face challenges finding suitable machinery because sometimes the size of the machinery coming from Europe is too big compared to our needs. But we need to upgrade technology to be more circular. Our industry really needs to upgrade. Collaboration with Europe is necessary to develop technology that meet our needs according to the proper size. Yes. On the other hand, in Latin America particularly, there is an ecosystem of startups growing, bringing a lot of innovation and circular solutions with the potential to bring also more eco-design for the industry. I have also seen large, medium, and small companies working together through innovation challenges, bringing solutions, benefit for the parties, and green jobs. We definitely need to create more green jobs, and we need circular economy to be profitable. That's a huge challenge and a global challenge. We are such an innovative region that we have added another R to the circularity, resourcefulness. We definitely are. And finally, a circular economy transition must close the gap between the public and the private sectors working together with international cooperation, because linear economy is about competition. The circular economy is about collaboration and the creation of shared value. And if we do our right work, circular economy represents a huge opportunity to maximize the talent and the local potential around a strategic and a systemic vision. As a result, we will have resource efficiency, more productivity, and we will be able to reduce negative environmental impacts. So I think that should be the approach.
Thank you so much, Slendy. Edna, in your work with the Pawanka Fund, you have already mentioned some of the ways in which you build essentially resilience via circular economic design. Would you like to share some more learnings about this, how we can essentially extrapolate some learnings from local, more rural type of societies, and how we can take some of these teachings into a wider economic change?
Yeah, that's a great question, and also something that can't be addressed now within the short time we have. However, Pawanka Fund believes in partnerships and and collaboration, not only and bringing the local experiences to the global level. And one example is where we have partnerships with Niatero and the World Union of Spiritual Practitioners and the Elders Council in a global initiative called the Wayfinder Circle, where we are bringing a collective, now it's 15 communities globally, from Africa, Asia, Latin America, Pacific, North America, that are working in stewarding and showcasing how they manage their landscape with different ecosystems, including those from Europe, And in the management, how they use traditional governance, also how they're building local economies, and in this, how they're stewarding, and also with the intent to show the world how traditional knowledge, intergenerational learning, local economy can really keep the ecosystem thriving and ensure integrity, but also a sustainable future for all. And they call it the Wayfinder because they want to show the way to the world and how it's done, and how other communities globally can also learn and adapt to that. And we have one partner in Kenya, for instance, the Gabra community, that are employing their traditional governance, stewarding more than 10,000 hectares of land, ensuring that they manage the landscape, whether through dry and wet seasons, and also how traditional governance have transcended generations, and how they're keeping it still 100 years on in stewarding these lands, but also how they are facilitating the traditional knowledge learning between the generations within their community, not only in Kenya, but also in Ethiopia. And I implore everyone to look up to and check the Wayfinder Circle and look up to the initiatives that we have from Asia, Africa, and all the 15 partners that we have globally, stewarding vast, over 30,000 hectares of land, but also sharing their learnings, and also building solidarity globally to showcase the way we need, because we need a difference in the way economic models are being run. Yeah. We need to show the way. Yeah.
Reintroduction of diversity within economic models, not just singular systematization, is very important. And Edna, Slendy, thank you so much. We have unfortunately run out of time. I'm going to close the panel by saying once again that this was an introductory panel, right? This is a very, very big topic that research agendas need to open themselves to. The secret of the energy and the economic transition, standing behind all of the sort of technical and design talk, is that actually we're going to have to face the reality that we need a transition of peace and security architectures. Because we have built those peace and security architectures over the last 100 years on linear economic systems, extractivism, and complex interdependencies that support a global system which is itself driving towards planetary exhaustion, and therefore human, international, regional, and planetary insecurity. Doing this, looking at the transition of peace and security architectures, requires actually opening ourselves up to different types of interdependencies in the world. Interdependencies between, or uncomfortable alliances, for example, between extractive actors that are a necessary actor within this energy transition, but whose impacts need to be mitigated and also reintegrated via regenerative practices, via collaboration with indigenous peoples, with communities in the areas where they are active. The supply chains essentially that we're trying to create to support the energy transition are the very spinal cords that will create the relationships in the future that will reinvent peace and security architectures. And the new element that we've never really had to look at in the past from an economic perspective and its relationship towards peace and security architecture is bioregionalism. We're going to have to see how we can create economic activities that regenerate soil, water, biodiversity systems, that regenerate ecological interdependencies, and that create regional resilience at a moment when climate disruption is essentially coming at us with full rage. This is the DNA of the future of cooperation and international interdependencies that will create the type of equilibriums that generate stability over time and remain dynamic and able and apt to face the threats that are coming towards us. Thank you so much. I'd like all of you to give a round of applause to all of our speakers.
Thank you. That was good. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you.
And of course, big thanks to Olivia. Give a round of applause for Olivia. We are indeed a bit over time, so I will just say, talk amongst yourselves, share what you've learned here. Don't let the learning and the inspiration end when the discussion ends. Like Olivia said, this should be the beginning, and it's certainly the beginning of a conversation that you can have with each other. I suggest you do that now as you move on with the rest of day 2. Enjoy.